They thought they could break down my door, but their faces went pale when I opened. The knocking started before the sun had fully decided to rise. It was not the polite, hesitant rap of a neighbor asking for sugar. It was a battering, a steady percussion of impatience and entitlement. I watched the clock on the mantel as if it were a judge. It blinked 6:07. The tile under my feet was cold, always cold at that hour, even with the morning sun trying to warm the kitchen window. I could hear the weight of the hammer in my son's hand through the wood, a thunk that made the whole frame vibrate. I pressed my forehead to the door and peered through the peephole. Rodrigo's face filled the glass, my son, the boy who used to bring me flowers from the market. His jaw was tight. Beside him stood Tatiana, her eyes hard and thin as if painted. In his right hand he held the kind of masonry hammer our builder used, the kind that makes you realize how easily wood gives way to force. Their children, Valeria and Santiago, were behind them, small and confused, their backpacks sagging. I had changed the locks 2 days before. The locksmith had been discreet and kind, a woman who ate at the same mercado as Consuelo, and who understood the look on my face when I asked for something private. I knew then that locks were not just metal and teeth, they were conversation turned into safety. Behind me, a voice I recognized like a second heartbeat whispered, "Leave him, I'll handle this." The voice belonged to Lic Arturo Bermudez Solis, the notary who had agreed to meet me that very morning. He was not a wallflower. He was the sort of man whose presence carried the steady calm of someone who had read difficult papers and refused panic. I felt the soft linen of his suit as he positioned himself quietly behind me, the folder in his hand making a faint, authoritative rustle. For a second the knocking stopped, or perhaps I only stopped hearing it. The house seemed to hold its breath. Rodrigo pounded again, louder, as if his knuckles could pound away the last bits of propriety. He called to me through the wood and used my name like it was a key he had misplaced. "Mama, open up! This is for your own good." I put one hand on the doorknob. The locksmith had made a small alteration, simple, clean. I had practiced turning the key in my mind a dozen times that week. I felt the cool metal, the momentary hesitation you feel before stepping on thin ice. I thought of Ernesto, as I always do when I am afraid. His voice is a compass inside me. He used to say, "Don't let them turn you into a victim. Fight." He did not mean fists. He meant mind and dignity. I opened the door slowly. They had expected me to be shocked, immobile, convinced by their hunger for my house. They had expected me to look small the way older women are taught to become small, apologetic, grateful for what crumbs they throw. But when my face met theirs, I saw the color drain out of Rodrigo's cheeks.
Tatiana's lips opened, then closed, and whatever rehearsed lines she had melted into something stray and unready. Valeria looked up at me as if trying to read whether I was the same grandmother who used to braid her hair. Santiago's hand found mine and squeezed, small and trusting. Their faces went pale. It was not the triumph I had imagined. It was the odd emptying out of courage that follows the sudden understanding that the game has changed. For a moment, the length of a held breath, there was an unreadable silence. Then Arturo took a step forward, and with the same calm that had carried him through years of notarial work, he opened his folder. "I will not give you every word Arturo said. Some things are better felt than catalogued. But I remember how the paper made a soft sound as it slid free. He held up a document like a card in a quiet magic trick. "This property is in an irrevocable trust," he said. "It was arranged last night. The ownership is protected. You have no right to enter the house under threat." Rodrigo made a small, sharp sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of someone trying to catch a collapsing plan. They had rehearsed rage and stubbornness. They had not rehearsed a notary standing in my kitchen. The hammer lowered in Rodrigo's hand like a man letting go of something heavier than he can carry. Tatiana's face went ashen, and for a second I saw not the woman who had painted over the dining room peach, but someone young and suddenly small. I did not shout. I do not shout. I have learned to let my voice be the calm in a storm. "You will not come in today," I said softly. My voice was steady because someone had steadied me. Ernesto's voice, Arturo's presence, and the small ferocity that grows in you when you remember who you are. I have told many versions of that morning. Memory edits like a careful editor. It leaves what matters and removes what is needless. But I want you to hear the rest, how this house came to be under threat, what I found in drawers and in the mouths of people who promised to help. If you want to hear exactly how I turned the tables on them, stick with me and subscribe. I promise you, it's a story worth staying for. They left that day. Rodrigo and Tatiana left with their children, their bags uneven and their faces still trying to understand how a house could defy them. I locked the door and leaned against it until the wood warmed. Then I sat down at the kitchen table where the sunlight pooled, and I let myself finally remember. It had begun so innocently. 3 months earlier, Rodrigo and Tatiana had called and said they needed a place to stay for a season. Rodrigo's job had some trouble, they said. Tatiana needed to get a medical test done, she said. The children would be enrolled temporarily at the school near my house. They promised not to be a burden. They brought plants as if to bless the rooms, and Valeria and Santiago ran through the hallways like new birds.
I remember I padded about, showing them where the sugar was and which towels were pink and which were for guests. I could feel my house relax in their presence, how houses do when they think they will be lived in. They praised the curtains, the ones my mother had sewn. Tatiana touched the framed wedding photo on the mantel and said, "You've kept so many beautiful things, Mama." Her voice was honey. Small things changed first. A different perfume scent in the morning, too sweet, too new, lingered in the hallway. A vase of cut flowers appeared on the counter and then was moved to make room for a new electronic device. The first week, a box of records, our vinyl collection, the one Ernesto treasured, disappeared. "We're sending those to a friend to care for them," Rodrigo said, casual as removing a coat. I trusted them. It is a strange anguish to feel your memories picked up like fragile dishes and placed somewhere else. A china set that had been my mother-in-law's, a thing we brought with us from our first house, had gone missing after 2 weeks. I had kept it in a glass vitrina, each plate like a moon in its own soft shadow. I asked where it was. Tatiana shrugged and said she had sold it to pay for urgent expenses. She said the money would come back to me. Later, I learned the vajilla had fetched 45,000 pesos from a buyer who did not ask many questions. I learned the number because it was written in a receipt I found in a drawer after they had gone through it. The receipts came like breadcrumbs. One said, "Medical Services, deposit 120,000 MXN, March 15. My hands shook when I saw it. Tatiana had told me she needed tests, urgent ones, and that the doctors required payment up front. I gave her the money because I believed her. She had the sad eyes and the small cough and a limp in her voice that made you hand over currency like a prayer. To me, money for health is not money, it is hope itself.
I gave her 120,000 pesos. Later, a neighbor, Doña Remedios, came with a look I could not ignore. She has the sharp eyes of someone who has watched too many things happen in this neighborhood to be surprised. I saw Tatiana in a cosmetic clinic last week, not a doctor's place. They were painting and putting things on. She looked new. I felt as if someone had taken the floor from under me. How could the same hands that wiped my counters be using my money for surgery? When I confronted Tatiana about the money, she cocooned herself in tears and said, "I will pay you back, Mama, I promise." Rodrigo said nothing. He looked at me like I had become a problem he had to manage. People around me began to say small things, things that prick you. You are being too trusting. Young people, they get carried away. Mama being too trusting is a cruel compliment. It feels like blame. There were nights when I cried so quietly, the house did not even wake.
I sat at the window and looked at the Virgen de Guadalupe image we had placed there years ago, speaking to a woman I had grown up praying to. I thought of Ernesto's hands on mine when he told me to be strong. I thought of the curtains, of plates, of music gone from the shelves. These were not mere objects. They were the map of a life and of a marriage. The gaslighting arrived as a slow, cold fog. Tatiana would say things that twisted memory. "You gave me permission to take things," she would say. "You said you wanted your house to be fuller." Rodrigo would nod, eyes rehearsed in the way of people who learn to agree early to avoid questions later. They told me I was making things up when I could not find a photograph, that my memory was poor, that perhaps what had been there had not been so precious anyway. Their words hurt most when they were gentle. Venom disguised as concern carries the most weight. Neighbors started calling too. Consuelo, I had known her for years, brought the first hint of what was really happening. She knocked on my door one afternoon with a recorder in her purse and the kind of tenderness older friends carry. "You don't have to do anything until you know for sure," she said, pressing the little device into my hand like a talisman. "But if you want to hear them when they say things in your house, this will help." I told myself I didn't want conflict. I told myself to be patient. I had been widowed for 7 years. Sometimes solitude makes you softer, more willing to let the world slide by. Maybe I was reluctant to see the sting behind a smile. Maybe I hoped that the children would be all right if they stayed with family. But trust, when it is abused, does not merely break, it recalibrates your soul. The theft of the vajilla and the records was not just loss of objects, it was the theft of my history. Someone had taken pieces of my marriage and found them easy to sell. Money, when it is not yours, is a slippery truth. I began to keep small notes, a pen, a paper list, where receipts and dates sat like small warring flags. The first time I heard them speak about the house as if it were not mine, I sat very still in the laundry room folding shirts. It was past midnight, around 2:37, and the house settles into the kind of whisper where you can hear phantoms. I had been up because the position of the night made my knees ache. I intended to go to bed, but a conversation drifted through the thin wall of the patio like spilled ink. "You see," Tatiana said, "she did not realize the words would get out of that room and into the open air, where no truth can hide. We put her in an asylum, and the house is ours in a month. We can't do it with her here. She is stubborn." Rodrigo's voice, quieter but there, said, "We'll sign whatever they need. We can move quickly."
I felt something pull inside my chest, part old fear, part a new righteous clarity. I went out to the patio, my slippers whispering on the stone.
The cool night smelled faintly of paint. Tatiana had repainted the guest room a clinical gray, and of incense candles, the kind people buy at the mercado when they want to cover the scent of cigarette smoke or to mask a tension in the house. They did not notice me then. They thought the walls would eat their words and keep them safe. I heard them map out a plan to move me into a cheap nursing home, to obtain quick forms, to sign away my name in paperwork that would make it easier to take the house. "We must hurry," Tatiana said. "We can't let her get wise." Rodrigo's voice was flat, as if he had practiced the tone of someone who issues facts. It was the voice of a man who was telling himself a story until he believed it. That patio conversation became the hinge of everything. When you hear people talk about taking your life, about the things you have known and loved, and they think they are being secret, something inside you rearranges into readiness. I could have screamed. I could have called the police with nothing measured. Instead, I did what Ernesto would have admired. I strategized. The next morning, I found Mejia's card, the old notary we had used years ago, tucked into the back of a book. I had not seen Arturo in a decade. Perhaps I had only kept his card because you keep certain small habitual things. My heart beat fast and then slow. I am not a woman who believes in luck. I am a woman who believes in making the right calls when the right call matters. I spoke to Consuelo. She brought over the recorder properly, showing me how to press the tiny red button, how the microphone would gather voices in the same room, as if it were a small, patient ear. "You have to be careful," she said, laying out a plan that was practical and simple. "Gather receipts, photograph everything, keep copies. If they say one thing in here and something else in there, you'll need proof." We started to collect evidence in the gentlest way. A photograph of the empty vitrina, a scanned copy of the receipt with 45,000 pesos written in an undecorated hand, the folded paper where I had written the date Rodrigo borrowed the car. I made a small folder in the little desk down the hall where I used to balance the household budget. I labeled it gently, for safety. There were long afternoons where I asked myself if I was becoming paranoid. Sometimes I would put the recorder on the windowsill and hear the sound of the street, vendors calling, men exchanging numbers, and feel a small ridiculous shame at the suspicion. Then I would open the folder and see the stub of a receipt or the photo of a missing plate, and the shame would turn to righteous steadiness. There were also moments of tenderness that made my chest ache. Valeria would bring me hand-drawn cards and put them on the fridge with magnets shaped like fruits. Santiago would climb onto my lap and call me Mama, the way only a small child can make all the weariness in you melt. I would whisper to them that I loved them and that nothing would change that. Children are not culpable. They are living proofs that love can be complicated and still be love. The day I decided to change the locks, I felt an odd shame, as if barriers were intimacies denied. But the locksmith's woman nodded and did not ask why. She looked at me like a woman who had seen too many older neighbors left vulnerable, and did what job she could. When the new key turned, it felt like a small, private verdict. I would not hand my life to someone because they claimed to be family. Everything accelerated after that midnight conversation. I began to sleep with the recorder on, tucked beneath a pile of towels by my bedside, the red light blinking like a small, defiant eye. I began to keep my purse under lock in my room again, and I started noting down cash I gave them and when. I called Arturo's number and left a message because I wanted to know in safe hands what could be done,
what a notary could do for a woman who had been quietly robbed of more than objects. I did not tell Rodrigo I had done any of this. There is a peculiar arithmetic to keeping plans from your children. You want them to be safe, but you cannot trust that their judgment is the same as yours. He would have called my actions paranoid. Tatiana would have called them theatrical. They would not understand that sometimes dignity requires paperwork as armor. One afternoon, while Tatiana was out, I found a small paper tucked behind the calendar in the hallway. It was a handwritten note with a name and a number, an appointment dated March 17 with a clinic that was not in the medical directory I trusted. The smell of the paper was like a small opening in a secret door. I slipped it into my folder. There is a particular sort of loneliness in being betrayed by the people you raised. My friends, women from the neighborhood who had seen their own children stumble in ways big and small, would come, bring casseroles, sit quietly and knit. Consuelo would take my hands and say, "You have good sense, Amparo, too good for some." She did not say it to inflame me. She said it like a fact, a comfortable stone to hold on to. I practiced small rehearsals in my head. What I would say if Rodrigo asked for the key, how I would decline offers of help that smelled wrong. I remembered Ernesto's last words, "Do not allow yourself to be small. Fight smartly, not with fury." He had been a man who loved being practical. I now used his practicality as a ledger for my own resolve. One night, 3 weeks after the midnight conversation, Tatiana's voice carried through the house again. I had the recorder on the kitchen counter, not because I planned to catch something, but because habits become shields. She spoke to someone on the telephone in a way that made my spine cold. She laughed about how they'd charm the old woman when signing. You could almost hear the plan fold in on itself like paper.
I clicked the recorder on when they were in the next room, not to spy, but to collect what might be needed to stand up to them in a world that prefers hearsay. Consuelo showed me how to put a little strip of tape over the microphone to reduce suspicion, how to keep the machine in plain sight but still effective. It felt small to be sneaking, and yet I kept thinking of plates with my mother-in-law's initials and of Ernesto's violin case missing. There are things you do when you feel cornered, and none of them are as noble as you would like, but they are honest. The evidence piled in small avalanches, a photograph of the supposedly repaired chair with a fresh seam that matched the stitches I had seen on the day Rodrigo's friend carried it away, a bank transfer with a memo simply saying, "Help," followed 3 days later by a deposit into an unfamiliar account, the receipt for a consultation that listed a non-medical procedure. I wrote dates in a notebook in my own shaky hand and placed them with the receipts like ration cards for sanity. I will tell you now that preparing for the moment of confrontation did not make me triumphant. It made me resolute. There is a difference. Triumph wants applause. Resolution wants only to be right. I was not interested in spectacle. I wanted safety, for me and for the children who did not deserve to be pawns. So I set the stage quietly. I found Arturo's card. I placed the recorder where a small ear could catch a plot without being discovered. I changed the locks. I began to catalog every plate and photograph, writing numbers on the backs of images where Ernesto's hand met mine in old pictures. I put aside the 120,000 pesos note and the receipt for 45,000. I wrote March 15 and March 17 in bold in my notebook so that I could see the arc of what was being done. And then, on a morning I had told myself would be ordinary, there was the hammer, the knocking, the small tremor of a plan arriving at my door in human form. When Rodrigo raised his hammer, he was not the boy who used to lift my packages with a soft laugh.
He was a man carrying something heavy enough to injure the very thing he should protect. I let the door open. I let them see that the woman they meant to push out was not the one they had rehearsed against. Their faces went pale when they saw me. It is a rare, pure moment when a lie meets its end and reveals the people beneath. They had planned speed and paperwork and coercion. They had not planned a notary in my kitchen, nor a quiet red-light recorder sitting on a shelf of my mind. Their faces told a story of something collapsing. I do not want you to imagine I had no fear in that moment. I had a great river of fear and a bank of resolve. Fear and resolve are not opposites. They are the two arms of the same bridge you cross when you choose to protect the life you have lived. I felt both.
But for the first time in many months, I also felt the peculiar warmth of being believed, not wildly, but in the concrete way of someone who had her documents, her friends, and a man named Arturo who could read Latin legal phrases and mean them. After they left that day, I sat with a cup of coffee gone cold and let the world slow. There would be more to do. I had evidence gathered, but still not complete. I had the recorder and the receipts and photographs, and I had the name of a notary I trusted. I knew what had to happen next, but I also knew that in telling you about it, I could not pretend it was swift or easy. There is a junction coming, a place where I had to decide whether to call the lawyer back, whether to play the recording in front of them, whether to put the house into a trust so the grandchildren would be safe. There are decisions that feel like scalpel cuts, precise and necessary. I made myself a list that afternoon, writing in the same notebook where I had taped the March dates. The list was practical: copies of receipts, more recorded proof, photographs of rooms before and after help had arrived, a timeline. At the bottom, I wrote simply, "Protect them, Valeria, Santiago." My hand shook as I wrote, but the words were clean. The children were not villains. They were, in my heart, reasons to be careful. That night, as I folded a towel and slid it into the old wooden drawer, I thought of all the things I had almost lost. The music from the record player, Ernesto's comb, the china with the faint crack that made it unique. But I also thought of something else, the small dignity of an elder who can still make choices. Too many people assume age equals helplessness. I now had a shred of proof to the contrary. It would be a lie to tell you I slept well that night. I did not. I listened for footsteps and woke each time I heard a car pass. But somewhere between the dark and the dawn, I slept long enough to dream of a house where the curtains my mother had sewn were back in the living room, and where Valeria's drawings filled the refrigerator. I dreamed of community classes where I could learn to paint again, not because of revenge, but because paint was the color of living. In the morning, I woke with one small, steady thought. The decision would have to be exact. If they had imagined that sheer force could open my door, they had underestimated something older than fear, an older patience, the kind that files papers and gathers witnesses and calls notaries. I went into the kitchen and found Arturo's card again. I dialed his number with hands that no longer trembled so badly. The call connected, and a voice on the other end told me simply to be where I was and to wait for a time we would agree upon. We had taken the first small necessary steps towards something that would be public. I had evidence in a folder, a recorder that could be a witness, and the faint, precise machinery of law to make my private life more private. He is a man who carries order. The leather made a soft, almost respectful sound when he set it on the table. He went straight to the point with the calm I had come to rely on. "We will present the facts," he said. "We will read what has been signed. You do not need to argue. Let the documents speak." I had placed the recorder in a visible spot on the bookshelf. It would be playing, yes, but it would also be a small talisman I did not have to explain. Consuelo arrived early, her hair tucked under a scarf even though it was warm, and she brought an extra thermos of coffee and the gentlest smile. "If you want me to, I will sit with the children while this happens," she said. "They should not be in the middle of grown things." I told her no. The children were part of the truth. They deserved to see that their grandmother was not a passive thing to be carried away. Rodrigo and Tatiana came later than the appointment time, as if tardiness were a small instrument of control. They had arranged this initially as a family conversation. They arrived with faces set, their clothes ironed, and their hands empty except for a small frayed backpack that Valeria hugged to her chest. When they stepped across my threshold, the air seemed to rearrange. Tatiana apologized for being late, as if she was performing civility. Rodrigo kept his gaze low. I offered them coffee anyway. The ordinary rituals I had learned can calm a room, even when the undercurrent is anything but calm. Arturo asked us to sit. He placed a clean sheet of paper between us, and when he slid it toward the centre, it read like a small island. Dates, signatures, a notarial seal. He did not begin with accusations. He let the room breathe, and then he read. "An irrevocable trust," he said, and there was the faint rustle of paper, "was executed last night, placing the property located at this address into a fideicomiso irrevocable, naming Doña Amparo Leticia Sandoval as its trustee, and specifying that upon her passing or incapacity, Valeria and Santiago will be designated as beneficiaries under the conditions listed." He explained in the simple language he always used that an irrevocable trust is a legal arrangement that changes how ownership can be transferred. It prevents impulsive sales or new unauthorized claims. He did not speak to frighten. He spoke to clarify. Rodrigo's hand found the edge of the table. His thumb tapped like a nervous small drum against the wood. Tatiana, who had always been neat with makeup, touched her lips as if rehearsing a line might help her compose herself. I watched them both, and in the same breath I thought of the night I had braided Valeria's hair. Memory is a stubborn thing. It will show you what you must protect. Then I pressed the small red button on the recorder and let the tape breathe out the patio conversation the night they had planned to move me into a home.
There was the faint hiss of the machine, the small electricity of listening, and then Tatiana's voice. "We have to hurry. If she gets wise—" Rodrigo's voice joined hers, flat and businesslike. "We can sign papers quickly. A signature here, a form there. She won't know." On the tape, their words were narrower, more uncaring than they had been in person. Listening to it felt like reading a map of how they intended to move through my life. When the recorder played, Rodrigo's face changed as if the sound had sculpted him anew. He inhaled a breath and let it tremble out of him. He had not expected his own words to be visible in the air like that. Tatiana's mouth opened and closed. For a moment, she seemed to be trying to find the sentence she had practiced to explain everything away. The children watched, puzzled, Valeria's eyes wide, Santiago's small fingers curled into the strap of his backpack. Arturo let the tape finish. He did not clap or cheer. He folded his hands and opened the folder to the next page. Copies of receipts, photographs of the empty vitrina, a bank transfer stub labeled the way transfers often are: help, advance, deposit. There was a receipt with 45,000 written in a brisk hand, the sale of my mother-in-law's china. There was a notation for March 15th, a deposit of 120,000 pesos for medical services. Arturo tapped the numbers with his pen so I could see them clearly. "You gave her money for tests," he said to Rodrigo and Tatiana, without accusation, just fact.
This paperwork shows the transfer of 120,000 pesos and the sale of property totaling 45,000. He set each piece of paper between them like a mirror. Tatiana's eyes filled. I will not lie and say it was pure contrition. People cry for many reasons: shame, calculation, weariness. She said in a voice that wobbled, It was for tests. I gave it for tests. Rodrigo, who once brought me flowers without prompt, now clasped his mouth to his mouth as if to keep his words inside. Arturo read the terms of the trust aloud. He showed the signatures, mine and his, and the notarized stamp. He explained gently that the trust had been established not to punish, but to protect, to ensure the home remained as it was, to safeguard the children's inheritance, and to make sure no abrupt move could remove what had been built across decades. When he spoke about the grandchildren, I watched Valeria's fingers go slack and Santiago's eyes fill in the way the ocean fills in a shore, slow and inevitable. "What do you want from us, Mama?" Rodrigo said finally, the question carrying the brittle edge of someone who had believed entitlement was an answer. I thought of all the times I had refused to grow smaller for anyone. I replied simply, "I want what is right," I said. "I want what is true. I want you to understand that this is not about winning against you. It is about protecting the life Ernesto and I had, and keeping some of it for Valeria and Santiago."
Arturo then did what he had promised to do. He read the formal request for restitution and for voluntary vacation of the property. He explained, in a voice that balanced firmness and legal neutrality, that the proper steps would be taken to secure the property, and that, given the evidence and the recorded admissions, immediate cooperation would be the most prudent path. He did not use the language of threat. He used the language of procedure. Paperwork, he said, can require actions the moment they are read into record. Rodrigo looked desperately around the kitchen as if searching for a way back into favor. His eyes met mine, and for the first time since the hammer, there was an imploring there that almost broke me. "We can fix it, Mama," he said. "We can make it right." "It is not yours to fix alone," I answered. "You took things that belonged to Ernesto and me. You used money given for health to do something else. Some of this can be remedied, some of it cannot. But the house is not something you can simply claim." I kept my voice level. I did not want us to become people who argued in front of children about things that could be solved with truth and time. Tatiana put her head in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought—" Then she could not complete the sentence. She had thought, and thinking had become a habit she used to justify action. We negotiated in the quiet way people make practical decisions. Arturo suggested documentation, that Rodrigo and Tatiana provide copies of any receipts they had, that they produce whoever had purchased the china, and that we confirm the account into which the 120,000 pesos had been moved. I did not expect miracles, only honesty. The children were asked to sit in the courtyard and draw, and Consuelo, like the friend she is, coaxed crayons from Valeria's small fingers. What happened next was not cinematic in the way films gloss over reality. It was human and clumsy and, thankfully, cooperative enough to avoid the raw edges of court filings. Rodrigo signed a paper acknowledging receipt of what had been presented and agreeing to cooperate with returning certain items and with a plan to account for the funds. Tatiana, through tears, wrote a note promising to take responsibility for the money she had asked for. Arturo did not promise me the world. He promised to file the appropriate documents that would signal the legal community there was an active dispute, and he advised that the trust would stand as a protective measure for the property. They did not pack everything and leave like a play with an ending. People rarely do. There were moments, messy and round, where apologies smelled of regret and where certain things were quietly returned.
A few plates were retrieved from a contact Rodrigo claimed had bought them when he thought no one would object. Not everything returned was in the same condition. There were minor chips and a scuff from being dragged from a shelf.
Money was not restored in full that day. Some sums were promised and then staggered in small payments. Arturo presented forms asking them to vacate and to provide an accounting. He asked them to leave any further dealings to the process. Before they left, Rodrigo came to the doorway and, in a voice I recognized again as my son's, said, "I'm sorry, Mama. I didn't know how else to do it." It was a confession wrapped in bewilderment. He did not step forward to embrace me. Boundaries had been redrawn, and there was a dignity I refused to allow to be smothered by swift consolation. I reached out and touched his cheek briefly. It was not a full forgiveness. Forgiveness is a garment you sew with time. But it was a recognition. He is my child, and there is love even where betrayal has broken trust. When they left, the house settled into a silence the way the sea calms after a storm. I closed the door and let the lock click. The sound was not vengeance. It was an agreement between me and my life. Arturo stayed to file papers, to place the notarial stamp where it needed to be, and to make sure that on the record there was an event that connected the night's words to the morning's actions. He showed me copies he would file and explained, without theatrics, that people's behavior could be constrained by the existence of documents and witnesses. It would be dishonest of me to say that everything was immediately easier. There were restless nights where I listened for the door and for a car that might return in anger. There were afternoons where I walked through the rooms and found small missing things and felt the hollow of absence. But there were also mornings where I opened the windows and the curtains my mother had sewn caught the sunlight exactly the way I remembered. I began to repaint a small section of wall with a peach the color of afternoons. I bought new hooks for the kitchen drawers and a vase that reminded me of the markets where Ernesto and I used to walk hand in hand. These small acts were not trivial. They were the stitches on the seam that made my days wearable again. Neighbors did what neighbors do. Some brought food, others brought gossip. Doña Remedios shook her head and brought me a plate of tamales. Consuelo came over and sat on the stoop, and we talked about paint colors and classes at the community center. "You should take that art class you always said you wanted," she told me. "Give yourself something that isn't defending." I laughed because she was right. Defense is tiring work if it is all you do. Arturo followed up with me in the weeks after the meeting. He filed documents and helped me formalize the directives within the trust. The house was to remain for my use during my lifetime and to transfer under specified conditions to Valeria and Santiago, conditions that made clear the house could not be sold or mortgaged by anyone acting on a whim.
The trust language was precise. It used the cold grammar of law to create warmth in the future. The fideicomiso irrevocable was, in its way, an heirloom, a tool that turned the memory of theft into a framework of protection. Not everything that had been taken returned to the shelves. Some records could not be recovered. One vinyl, the one Ernesto loved most, was gone. I mourned that small thing for a week, and then decided to honor it by learning again to play the old songs on a borrowed record player. Music can be a way to stitch the lost into a new pattern. There were practical consequences for Rodrigo and Tatiana, too. They moved out over the next days and weeks in fits and starts, carrying their boxes, their embarrassment, their apologies. Some things were left behind: clothes, a bent lamp, a plant that had been overwatered. The children came and went between houses, and slowly a new routine arranged itself. Not the one we had been forced into, but a quieter map that kept their welfare in sight. Part of my plan always included the grandchildren. I did not want the house to become a weapon lodged between grown people. I wanted it to be a place where Valeria and Santiago would still come to learn the recipe for tamales, to see the Virgen de Guadalupe on the sill, to have space for homework and laughter.
So we revised the trust's language to make clear that they would be the eventual beneficiaries, under conditions that meant their well-being was to be protected and they could not be used as proxies for ulterior motives. It felt sometimes like writing a hymn, small lines that had to be exact, sacred in their detail. Healing is a slow work. I began to attend a painting class that met twice a week at the community center. I bought cheap brushes and cheap canvases and allowed myself to be bad at painting. The first painting looked like a riot of color that no one would hang, but by the fifth canvas I had a small scene, a kitchen table with a cracked mug and a sunlight stripe. The class made friends for me. Women of different ages and stories gathered around small easels and swapped brushes and gossip. We drank coffee and swapped advice about which brand of paint was most forgiving. It was both small and enormous, the way simple company can be. I also joined a small support group, a circle of neighbors who had navigated children's disappointments and betrayals. We met in the library and spoke about boundaries, how to name them, how to put them in place, how to keep them gentle for the young but firm for those who confuse closeness with license. I found solace in hearing other people's stories and offering the odd practical thought, the name of a trustworthy locksmith, how to photograph receipts, where to place a recorder without getting discovered. The group did not replace the sorrow, but it offered scaffolding for the days ahead. Months passed.
There were legal follow-ups, documents signed, an accounting of some returns, and the trust maintained as the boundary we had set. Arturo continued to be the calm presence who would answer questions over the phone with the same clarity he had that first morning. I never wanted to make him a hero. He was a professional who understood how a pen and a stamp could protect a life. Time, being the slow craftsman it is, did its work. The peach paint grew back on the walls. The curtains my mother had sewn were rehung. I bought a new shelf for the records and labeled it with a small note in my own handwriting. Some things return, some changes arrive. Valeria came less as someone caught between adults and more as a child who loved to make toast with my help. Santiago learned to whistle poorly and then better. These ordinary successes were the ones that mattered most. People sometimes ask if I feel reconciled. Reconciliation for me is not a single moment. It is a series of small decisions. Choosing not to place a call that will only reopen a wound, choosing to spend a Sunday afternoon with someone who needs a simple treat, choosing to maintain a boundary when a voice asks you to give more than you should. I do not pretend to have a clean slate with Rodrigo or Tatiana. I have a frame of honesty and a set of rules we must follow if we continue to be in each other's lives. There have been offers of mediation and suggestions from acquaintances about how to proceed with the accounts. I accepted only what felt right and refused to let my life be a play for public opinion. The trust remained the spine of the arrangement. It is not a weapon, it is a safeguard. It allows me to sleep knowing that the house where Ernesto and I lived is a place that will someday belong to the grandchildren he would have adored. Sometimes, when the house is quiet in the afternoon, I sit by the window and look at the Virgen on the sill. The light slants in and makes the colors glow. I think of the night the hammer came, and of the day their faces went pale. I do not say those words with glee. I say them as a record, that there was a moment when truth met force, and the truth, armed with paper and witness, held. What I learned in all of this is a simple architecture of dignity. Boundaries matter. Paperwork is not cold. It can be a warm protector when wielded with good intention. Friends like Consuelo and Arturo are the hands that steady you, and never ever underestimate the weight of listening to your own story.
I had to allow myself to hear the evidence, to catalog my losses, to ask the hard questions, and to act in ways that would preserve what was most precious: memory, the children's future, and the integrity of a life. People have asked me since, in the gentlest voices, what they should do if something like this happens to them. I always answer the same way: gather witnesses, keep receipts, call someone you trust, and remember you are not alone.
But I do not give legal prescriptions. I do not pretend the law is the same everywhere. My story is one path through a tangled place. It is one woman's way of choosing resolve over despair. One afternoon, not long ago, I took Valeria to the market, and we bought a small set of plates, nothing like my mother-in-law's china, but pretty in their own way, and we used them that evening to serve tamales. We laughed as if the past had been a long, detailed storm, and the present was simply a brightness we were finally learning to enjoy. I taught Valeria how to fold the masa and how to pinch the ends so the tamal keeps its shape. Santiago painted a picture of the house with broad strokes and a fierce sun. There are no grand public declarations in my life anymore. There are small, steady restorations, repainting the living room, putting a new nameplate on the mailbox that I wrote myself, sitting in the yard with neighbors and sharing recipes. The trust waits like a promise written down by careful hands. The record of what happened is filed and held by a notary whose stamp is crisp on the paper. The house is my house. The grandchildren will, in time, have a claim to it under conditions that respect their well-being. I tell you all of this because I want you to have a picture that is both honest and hopeful. Abuse of trust within a family is a particular, thorny thing. It leaves you wondering where to place blame and how to keep love without being naive. My answer is, box your memories with care, place your life behind a door you lock for the right reasons, and keep friends who will be witnesses to your story. If you are watching and your heart is heavy because you felt similar betrayal, I invite you to share where you're watching from in the comments. Tell us what small step you took. Maybe it was keeping a receipt. Maybe it was calling a neighbor. If this story moved you, or you know someone who needs courage, share this with them. We are a community of people who have hidden small truths behind the furniture and who are learning to bring them into the light. The last thing I will tell you is this: there is power in being an older woman who refuses to be diminished. The clock still reads different things at different times. Sometimes it says grief, sometimes it says joy. But on the days it says enough, there is always a choice. For me, choosing to stand up did not make me cruel. It made me careful. It made me keep the house not out of spite, but out of love, for the past that shaped me and for the children who will shape what comes next. If my story gave you strength, if it made you think of a neighbor or a friend, share it. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you feel safe, tell your own small truth in the comments. We are, together, the witness that many of us need. Thank you for staying with me through these mornings and afternoons, the papers and the recorder, the paint and the tamales. For anyone who feels alone right now, you are not.
There is help in a friend's palm, in a notary's folder, in a list of receipts, and in the quiet courage of your own steady breath. If you want to see more stories like this, or to hear the people who helped me, Arturo and Consuelo, speak about what they recommend in practical, non-legal terms, subscribe and come back. And if this reached you, share it with someone who might need the small proof that dignity can be protected. Wherever you are and whatever time your clock shows, protect the life you have lived. Guard the things that tell your story. Hold your head steady. It is never too late to insist on your dignity.